Okay, thanks Henry, and thanks for chairing today. I'd also like to thank Joost at the BIEA for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research project, which is ongoing, and also like to thank Neo for organising the seminar today. As you can see from the screen, the title, the working title of my project at the moment is News Media, Political Reconfiguration and the Continued Relevance of Ethno-nationalist Discourses in Somalia. And as Henry said, I'm working on this PhD project for the Centre of African Studies at the University of Edinburgh, but I've been in the region and around Somalia, for the last five or so years. Okay, so we start, as my supervisor always told me to, with the question, and a why question. And this question is, for my research, why do discourses of Somali ethno-nationalism remain important in the context of political reconfiguration or state reconstruction in Somalia? When we look at Somalia as outside observers or on the ground in Somalia, it's very easy to identify and see the extreme political fragmentation that exists in Somalia. Legacies of the civil war, 2 decades of statelessness. And so in this context of fragmentation and ongoing conflict in some parts of Somalia, how is the imagined community, to use Anderson's classic sort of definition of his definition of nationalism, the imagined community of Somali nationalism produced, reinterpreted, utilised in the Somali public sphere? And when I talk about the public sphere here, I'm talking about mostly about popular culture and news media, sort of forums and media, which I've had quite a number of opportunities to engage with over the last few years, which I'll explain to you as I go through. And linking the sort of the abstract, the discourse of nationalism and shared community and imagined communities to something a bit more tangible and concrete, I'm looking at whether or not there is something particular about the news media environment in Somalia and in the Somali-speaking world, which is far broader than Somalia itself, that influences the development of these discourses and the way that they are used in politics and state reconstruction or political reconfiguration in Somalia. So, a little bit about my background and also a disclaimer about the stage that the research is at the moment. I've been working in and around Somalia since 2009. Between 2009 and 2011, I worked for the University of Hargeisa in what is known as Somaliland, northwestern Somalia. I was running an English language department there and working on my Somali language. After being there for 2 years, I started a PhD at CAS looking at political discourses in Somaliland. I did a year of that project and then basically ran out of money and couldn't really afford to do the fieldwork that I wanted to do in Somaliland. So I took a job working for the International Committee of the Red Cross, who were recruiting expatriate interpreters to work in Somalia. And so from 2012 until, the end of last year, I was working for the ICRC in Somalia. And as Henry said, the main part of my work was with what was known as the Protection Department. And you may know that the International Committee of the Red Cross has a sort of a traditional mandate of visiting prisoners of war or people who are either detained as a result of the conflict or people who are victims of that conflict. And so I spent a lot of the last 2 years working in prisons in Somalia, where I had the opportunity to meet a lot of interesting people, both in terms of the detainees, people who were being held in relation to the conflict, and the political authorities who were trying to make these prisons work, and people involved in the day-to-day business of reconstructing the state in southern Somalia. And so my work with the ICRC was mostly in Puntland and south central Somalia. And as part of my job as an interpreter and as a translator, I was spending a lot of time looking at media products, about things going on in the public sphere, in the sort of the consciousness of the Somali nation, about issues of humanitarianism, about perceptions of the conflict, perceptions of actors who are working in the conflict context, actors like the ICRC, for example. And I was coming across, a huge amount of data, and which really interested me about how people were talking about reconstruction of Somalia and these discourses of nationalism being used in different ways by different actors. So my disclaimer here is that this project is very much a work in progress. The last couple of years I've been able to collect a large amount of hard data, newspapers, newspaper articles, online media, videos, cartoons, songs, the texts which a lot of this project will be based. But I'm now, having left the ICRC, I'm in a position where I'm able to do the field work, the interviews, the focus groups, talking to people on the ground in Somalia about these issues and about the media environment. So the purpose of the paper that I wrote for you guys here is to introduce the context and introduce the context of political fragmentation that exists in Somalia, explain my question. I want to give some preliminary observations about these discourses of nationalism in the public sphere of media in Somalia, based on what I've been doing the last couple of years and the text that I've already put together. And then at the end of this, I'd like to discuss the methodology that I'm using for the ongoing phase of my research now, which is analysing these texts and interviewing people in Somalia. And the critical feedback after I finish talking, or during, feel free to interrupt, would be much appreciated. So please share with me your thoughts and feelings. So to start with, just to try and sort of explain the context, I don't know how familiar people are in this room with the conflict in Somalia. The most obvious aspect of political fragmentation in Somalia that one sees in the media, and that can cross borders very easily and is part of the sort of popular consciousness worldwide, is to do with the conflict in South Central Somalia, and also Puntland to a certain extent, between the Somali Federal Government, which is the now internationally recognised federal government which exists in Mogadishu, which is supported by the African Union Mission for Somalia, known as AMISOM, politically, militarily, and their conflict, their battle against the Islamist militant movement Harakat al-Shabaab al-Mujahideen, more commonly known as al-Shabaab. Now, Harakat al-Shabaab al-Mujahideen, HSM, are often referred to as insurgents. Now, HSM used to control and govern and administer quite large proportions of territory in Somalia. So one could describe the incoming forces as the insurgents, but that's the discourse of terrorism and insurgency these days. So we'll go with that. But this is the main conflict that you see that is portrayed in Somalia at the moment. But at the same time, you have these parallel processes of federalization. So we have a federal government in Mogadishu. It is trying to reconstruct a national government which is based on federal lines. So this means dividing up the regions that currently make up Somalia into federal states, and then clarifying the relationship between these federal states and a central government in Mogadishu. And this process has really been ongoing for the last year or so. It's still ongoing. It's nowhere near complete. It's highly complicated, contested. There's many difficulties with the interim constitution in Somalia, which don't give perhaps the precise details that are necessary to make this go a bit smoother. And this process of defining these regional states is linked to clan politics inside Somalia. Now, in the paper that I wrote, I go into a bit of depth about what I mean when I talk about clan politics, because the whole clan question, or the tribal question in Somali politics, is very complicated. It's very sensitive, especially for a foreign researcher like myself. And you really have to engage in the debates that have gone on through the literature and continue to go on today about what this thing is that is clan and what does it mean from politics. And in the paper I look at the sort of the classical debates between the primordialists who see clan as being this sort of ever-present factor and quite a sort of a concrete identity that exists in Somalia that influences the way people do and think about politics. But then I look at the critique of that interpretation, which is more the modernist approach, which sees clan as something being a lot more fluid and contested and dynamic, and talks about it as being a force which is and a discourse which is linked to the realities of Somali politics, and is something that people think about and use, but something that is not fixed but changes in terms of circumstances and the realities of the conflict. And one of the most recent and quite controversial works on clan politics in Somalia is a book by Kaptajins, who talks about the clan cleansing in Somalia as an aftermath or a precursor as well to the civil war which brought about the collapse of the Somali state in 1991. She uses the term clan construct as to signify an identity, a perceived group identity or affiliation which is constructed by different groups for different purposes and in different ways at different times. And her book talks about what she describes as the specific, the deliberate agendas of certain groups in Somalia at the period of the state collapse around 1991 to ethnically cleanse certain parts of Somalia of certain clans that were associated with the former regime, Siad Barre, or other groups like that. It's a very controversial book, but the way in which she discusses clan constructs, I think, is very helpful, and it hints on the way in which these, what I call here the meta-narratives of Somali political history, which are still very important in Somalia. When I say the meta-narratives of Somali political history, I'm talking about the way in which certain clan family groups, as very broad entities who are by no means monolithic, but these discourses you see in the public sphere, perceive the history of the Somali state, how they perceive the collapse of the Somali state, and how they see the current process of reconfiguration of the Somali state. And so this, as I said, I mean, the federalization process is ongoing, and so these discourses are really coming into the fore of public consciousness and news media and the public sphere in Somalia. And so the history and a lot of this unfinished business, or the legacies of what Kaptajins, for example, describes as the clan cleansing, are now coming out in this much more recent process of federalization, because there's jockeying for power and influence and resources within what will become a new federal Somalia. But this shouldn't distract from the fact that even though we can talk about clan constructs and the meta-narratives, we have to remember that clan contestation within the clan system can happen at any level. We look at sort of the broad clan families down through the sub-clans. And just to give you a very quick definition, there's in Somali called abtirso, the counting of your ancestors. in anthropological terms, clan being the patrilineal model whereby people trace back their male ancestors to find commonalities at different levels of the ancestors. So basically, clan is an analytical minefield in Somalia, and you have to engage with the literature before you start looking at these discourses that perhaps transcend that. So I have a nice, fairly detailed map of Somalia here, just to give you a sense of my perception of where the political fault lines in Somalia at the moment lie, and the current process of federalisation. Down in the south, we have the Gedo, Middle Juba and Lower Juba regions, which seem now to be coalescing into a Jubaland federal region, which has its base in Kismayo. And the Jubaland administration seems to be dominated by certain fairly powerful Ogaden subclans of the Darud clan family. Jubaland was challenged for a while by a political project known as the SW6, Southwest 6 project, which was based mainly in Baidoa. This was an idea for a federal state which encompassed the 6 regions of Bokol, Bay, Gedo, Middle Juba, Lower Juba, and also Lower Shebele. This seems to have been eclipsed. There's been a huge amount of political pressure coming from Mogadishu and from the international community to sort of squelch this idea of SW6, and so we now have a reality that looks like it's coalescing around a Jubaland region and then a 3-state region of Lower Shebele, Bay and Bokol region. Mogadishu politics continues as usual, really, in Mogadishu, and which is a very cosmopolitan clan centre. Then we have the status of Hiran and the Shebele regions. The two of them is still fairly unclear. There was talk of a united Shebeloyinka region of the Shebels, but that might have fallen out of fashion. And Hiran region continues more or less to govern itself. Up in the central regions. But a lot of the big momentum now is to establish a federal region, a region of central states which will encompass Galgaduud and Mudug, where the powerful Hawiye subclans who predominate in that area will be in charge. Unfortunately, the problem is that Mudug region, the northern half of Mudug region, is claimed by Puntland. And so, in order to make a Gal Mudug, the central region, you'd have to divide Mudug, which is currently not provisioned for in the constitution. So that will cause that's going to be a serious sticking point. And then so we bring into play Puntland and Somaliland up here. Puntland has been basically an independent autonomous state since 1998, when it announced itself on the scene, and continues to, it has a fairly centralised and coherent administration based in Garowe. And continues to play its games in the wider context of Somali politics. And in Somaliland, the great outlier, as it were, which claimed full independence and its desire to secede from Somalia in 1991 as a response to the destruction of the civil war and the persecution perceived by the Isaac clan against them from the regime in the south. And then, just to make it a little bit more complicated, we have the disputed territories between Puntland and Somaliland of Sanag and Sul, where the local clan groupings who are Darod clan, but not of the subclans most associated with the Puntland regime, either are trying to defend their own political interests, either through allegiance to either Somaliland or Puntland, or through certain experiments such as the Katumo state project, which also is trying to claim a degree of autonomy in Sol region. So then that's the Somali politics. You add on top of that the role of the international community and the international military actors who are involved on the ground in Somalia, most notably AMISOM and its troop contributing countries, which include Somalia's neighbours Djibouti, Ethiopia and Kenya, and their various interests in the regional politics and who is empowered and who is disempowered by these processes. And then Al-Shabaab. HSM, Harakat Al-Shabaab al-Mujahideen, which in the last year or so has been pushed out of a lot of urban territory. Barawe fell quite late in 2014. And so most of the urban centres that Al-Shabaab was controlling in southern Somalia are no longer in their hands. But they have melted into the hinterland, into the bush, and are still present in large parts of the Jubbas. They still control Badere and Buale and Jilib, important towns along the Jubba River, and they're in the hinterland all over south central Somalia, as well as up in the Galgala Hills, where they fight against the Puntland forces and the Americans, who also have had boots on the ground. Yes?
If you want to leave this question and come back to it later, feel free.
No, please.
The question is this. At the beginning, you said that your empirical work is to document and analyze ethno-national ideology or positions as expressed in various media.
Yep.
Following this very rich description of the diverse, sort of disjointed nature of what used to be the Republic, when you speak of ethno-nationalistic expressions of ideology or whatever, are you looking at the specific expressions of political identity within these various groupings, mixture of clan and geography that you've just described? Or are you entirely, or at least partly interested in the context in which an all-encompassing pan-Somali expression or ideology or whatever comes out in particular media or context or whatever, wherever you're getting your data, and whichever one you're mainly focused on, I know you never have enough time and resources to do everything, is there a particular hypothesis or argument that you're putting out or you'd like to put out in terms of describing either what material related to this theme comes out where, or by whom, or it's simply to map. I'm not saying that the latter isn't worthy, just to map the context without trying to argue why it is that some appear in certain contexts that not. I say if you want to hold that off to the discussion.
Well, I think the next part of the talk should answer to those questions.
Sorry,
no, not at all. So if the next part doesn't answer it, then I'll come back to it after I've finished. But I'll get to that now. So yes. Then we have the context of political fragmentation. So what are the shared cultural or ethno-nationalistic identities within this context? And so what I noticed, and what I began to notice more and more as I was doing work and translating and analysing these texts of Somali news media and presentations of the conflict and these different narratives of contestation, was the fact that nationalism and the question of Somali ethno-nationalism kept coming back into all of these discourses. Everyone, excluding certain actors, which I will come to later, were using Somali ethno-nationalism in a way that was able to forward their agenda and use it as a unifying factor against certain ideologies or certain political projects. Now, if we look at the history of ethno-nationalism in Somalia, we have to look first at the relative homogeneity of Somalia in comparison to its regional neighbours of Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, for example. Compared to the neighbouring states in the Horn of Africa, Somalia is relatively homogeneous in terms of ethnicity, religion, language, and arguably there is cultural homogeneity if we define that in terms of the way Somalis talk about their, especially economic modes of production, and the way they see sort of the ideal conceptions of Somali identity in relation to economic production. And I'll touch upon that as I go on. If we look at the history of the anti-colonial struggle against the British and the Italians and the post-colonial state, we could see a state being built on quite a specific ethno-nationalist narrative. Somalia is a country of the Somalis, people who are ethnically Somali, who speak Somali, who are Muslims, right? And so the idea of Greater Somalia, which came out through the anti-colonial struggle and the post-colonial state, refers to the Somali populations who are the ethnic Somali populations who are not inside the Somali nation state. So we're talking about northeastern Kenya, eastern Ethiopia, what's known as the Ogaden or Zone 5, and Djibouti. And I put the little flag up here because the 5 stars of the Somali flag, the ultimate symbol of Somali ethno-nationalism, then and now, the 5 stars symbolise the 5 territories, the 5 territories perceived as being ethnically Somali, which were cut off from what became Somalia. And the 5th was Somaliland, which the British protectorate of Somaliland, which became fused with Italian Somalia to become the nation state of Somalia. So these discourses of ethnicity and ethno-nationalism were there from the beginnings of the Somali nation state. And this history is still referenced a great deal by many different political actors in Somalia to justify various agendas or claims. So ideas of what it means to be quote-unquote Somali are constantly being reproduced through news media and political communication. So the preliminary observations that I'd like to make on the basis of my experience in Somalia so far are first that the conflict narratives of both Al-Shabaab and the Somali Federal Government are framed in differing ethno-nationalist terms. Now, if we look at the conflict narratives of Harakat al-Shabaab al-Mujahideen, we can see a clear portrayal of religious homogeneity of the Somalis fused with an ethno-national identity. Now, when people study the discourses of Al-Shabaab, they often look at them in terms of the links that they have to sort of these transnational ideas of jihad and Islamist militancy across the world, from ISIS to the Taliban in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen to Somalia. But if we look at a lot of the cultural products, which are media products that are being put out by Al-Shabaab, they're playing on very specific notions of Somali ethnicity, of shared Somali political history, and economic identity and nationalism. And I'll show you some examples of that as I go through. Their conflict narrative highlights the role of external actors, so the UN, AMISOM, the United Nations, referencing particular troop contributing countries to AMISOM, such as the Ethiopians and the Kenyans, who are very much seen as being historical enemies. But then place this narrative, which includes a very strong ethno-nationalist context, in a narrative of global jihad and a global battle that they say is being waged against Islam by the West, with local stooges and actors. And then, as I said, there's a quite serious reference to Somali economic nationalism and what are described very consciously in this material as traditional modes of livelihoods, which are only possible, the propaganda argues, with the control that and the rule of Sharia law, which Al-Shabaab is able or has been able to impose and still does impose on certain areas. So I just want to show you a quick example of this. This is a video produced by Al Furqan Media Network, which is a media network affiliated with Al-Shabaab. And last year they produced a series of documentaries which talked about the conflict in Somalia. But more interestingly, from my perspective, they talked about economic nationalism of the Somalis, the way in which certain livelihoods are perceived as being quintessentially Somali, and how these are able to be practiced in areas controlled by Al-Shabaab. So the video's in Somali, but I'll give you a synopsis translation. It's only 30 seconds. So let me just... Is this going to work? Come on. Okay, so this video, the narrator is talking about the invasion of Somalia, the colonial invasion of Somalia, which he says has many faces. And he talks about the division of the Somali community and the exploitation that facilitates of the resources inside Somalia. And he talks specifically about agricultural production. You saw the shots of the farms and stuff there. And so this division of Somalia and exploitation of the resources, he argues, leads to the migration, the emigration of the Somali population overseas, tahrib, leaving Somalia to the Gulf states, to Europe, and that's why you saw shots of people being rescued from the Mediterranean. These are migrants, which the argument is that this is being caused by the colonial exploitation of Somalia, which is going on now. He talks about with military power of this invasion comes a colonialism of the mind, which encourages dependence and impoverishment of the Somalis, who are led to believe that their country is not rich in resources when it actually is, and when there is, enough resources for economic self-sufficiency in Somalia. So you can see, this type of material is very common in Al-Shabaab circles, and these three images here are from three different films, also from Al Furqan Media, which talk about traditional stoneware cutting in Galgaduud region. This one's about producing sesame oil through the traditional methods of using camels to grind the machinery and grind the sesame seeds in Barawe. And this one is really interesting. This one talks about the role of livestock traders in the market in different parts of Somalia. The point is that in all of these places where these videos were being shot in 2013, 2014, they were all under the control of Al-Shabaab. And so therefore Al Furqan Media has access. They produce these pieces of what are political propaganda, all of which play on very specific themes of economic nationalism and identity of what it means to be a Somali in an economic context. So if we then look at an opposing narrative, the narrative of the Somali Federal Government based in Mogadishu, the SFG is reconstructing or trying to reconstruct a federal Somali state. And if you have any idea the level of destruction which state institutions underwent over the last 2 decades, and the impact this has on any kind of reconstruction of political power in Somalia, then you would know that the symbols and iconography of the nation state in Somalia, these discourses of unity, are going to be profoundly important for the Somali Federal Government's reconstruction of the state. And so just as HSM are describing its enemies as either being outsiders or being the stooges of outsiders, the SFG conflict narrative critiques HSM themselves as being dominated by people who are not from Somalia. They play on the idea that the brand of Islam being promoted by Harakat al-Shabaab Mujahideen is not one that is traditionally Somali. That al-Shabaab is dominated by foreigners, by foreign jihadists who have other agendas, and therefore is contrary to this nationalistic or ethno-nationalistic conception of Somalia. Now, of course, if we start to talk about what is quote-unquote Somali Islam, this can be very difficult because the history of political Islam in Somalia and the dichotomies that people draw between, for example, Salafism and Wahhabism, which are seen as imports into Somalia, and quote-unquote traditional Somali Sufi Islam are quite complicated, and I don't really have time to get into them today, but I do touch on these issues in the paper. But a contest over what Somali Islam is in an ethno-nationalist context is a big part of these discourses. So the second observation that I make is that outside of the HSM SFG propaganda war, in the wider public sphere, discourses of clanism and the role of external actors and nationalism are prevalent. So across the media in Somalia, in news articles, in cartoons, in songs, in satire, there is so often a popular critique of clanic division, or the Kalakabio discourse, as I call it. And the perception is, from many actors across the ideological sphere, that Somalia is being exploited, the divisions in Somali society are being exploited by external actors to divide the Somalis and to produce this condition of dependence. So political groupings in Somalia are seen as being client states, right? Somaliland is seen as being a client state of Ethiopia, which Ethiopia uses to divide the Somalis. Jubaland is seen as being a proxy of the Kenyan government, again to create a buffer zone between Kenya and divide the Somalis. This is not just a narrative of the jihadists. This is something that goes way beyond that in the public sphere. And the perceived remedies to these exploitations and divisions are presented as being nationalism, embodied often in the flag, and an idea again of Somaliness, whatever that is, or Islam, or both, and a fusion of these two identities. And again, along with that comes a distrust expressed in many areas of political elites who are seen as being stooges to these powers. So this is a cartoon from a guy called Amin Amir, who's a very famous cartoonist who produces a huge amount of work about politics in Somalia. You have the image of Somalia being stamped on by the jackboot of Ethiopian military occupation, and the two guys who always appear in these cartoons commenting on the state of Somali politics say the Somali politician who's in the chair has this intention, to break up Somalia, and God help those who are patriots, and Amen, he says. And so, this cartoon is indicative of those kind of discourses that I was just talking about, this idea of foreign influence, corrupt politicians, and the division of Somalia along clanic lines or regional lines. My third and final observation I'd like to make at this point regards the sort of the media environment and the technological context in which I want to situate my research on these rather abstract discourses of nationalism and cultural identity. And the point that I want to make here is that the news media market is fragmented, privatized, and monopolies or controls of information across the context are limited or non-existent. In Somalia, the very context of state collapse and statelessness, combined with a boom in the telecommunications market over the last 20 years itself, which has been a product of this free market that's existed in Somalia, has meant that you've had just this huge proliferation of news sources, and the importance of the internet in this context cannot be underestimated. If you consider the fact that in Somalia in general libraries don't exist, national archives don't exist because of the destruction of the civil war and fragmentation, the internet really has become a primary repository of cultural products which are consumed across Somalia. And even products which are not necessarily consumed on the internet, like radio, for example, which is how most people in Somalia get their news, these things are uploaded online and they have a home online through the various media houses. And so there's a great deal of overlap between sort of quote-unquote traditional media and this new media. And so also within this context you have the influence of the diaspora. And this is something that I'm very interested in because what you have is this sort of transnational nationalist production. People outside of, Somalis outside of Somalia who are identifying with Somalia, promoting certain images of what Somalia was, what it is, what it will become, who are the people there, what is the religion, etc. And transmitting this back into the news environment. Now, for example, the cartoon that I just showed you by Amin Amir, this guy, he's in Toronto. Right? He's not in Somalia. He lives in Toronto. But he produces a huge amount of work and is referenced all over Somalia, almost like no one else is, about quite in-depth insights into politics all across Somalia. And he's in the diaspora, and yet he's very intimately plugged into the sort of the popular consciousness of political debate in Somalia. Another point here, essentially the armed opposition, Al-Shabaab, in many cases has a more effective propaganda machine or apparatus than the Somali Federal Government. If you look at the quality, forgetting the discourse, the propaganda, whatever, you look at the sophistication of some of these media products that are being made, it's obvious that these guys know what they're doing. They have a coherent narrative, regardless if you may disagree with it, and very good access to technology. And so in the whole process of the state reconstructing itself in Mogadishu, the government in Mogadishu has to work very, very hard to catch up with this, to be able to put its narrative out there across different media and have something that's coherent and will draw people in. I mentioned the telecommunications boom, which I think plays a significant role in this, the ultra-privatization of the media market. And then just the final point here, the role of journalists and media in regard to the state reconstruction process is something that's come up in the international media quite a lot in the last couple of years. There have been cases, especially in Mogadishu, of journalists being arrested for reporting certain stories or certain narratives that the Somali Federal Government didn't want necessarily to be put out there. For example, regarding sexual violence allegedly perpetrated by government troops against vulnerable members of the population. Journalists who reported that were arrested and spent time in prison. This became a big case. And more recently, journalists who have been accused of spreading clan hate narratives, which have the effect of destabilising Mogadishu, they've also been arrested, and this has become big news. And also in Garowe at the moment, there's a current controversy over certain websites being closed by the government. And so this is becoming more prevalent across Somalia, and it illustrates the importance of news media in this context of state reconstruction. Now, Somaliland. As I said, I spent 2 years in Somaliland, and that's where I sort of really gained my interest for political discourse and political identity in a Somali context. And I'm including it in my analysis because Somaliland represents a very different type of nation-state building project, and it's one which does not necessarily employ so much the wider ethno-nationalist narratives or identities which are used elsewhere. Somaliland nationalism is born out of collective historical memory, primarily by a certain clan family construct, the Isaaq, who claim that they were always marginalised by a unified Somali state, by the other major clans who dominated in Mogadishu in the south, that they resisted this, that they were persecuted by the regime of Siad Barre. To the extent that the Somali armed forces were being used against large parts of the Somaliland Isaaq population, and they describe this history as being one of genocide. They use that word specifically, and so the nation-state project in Somaliland is born out of this history and a desire for secession and separation from the rest of Somalia. And also the narrative of peace building and democracy building that they say that they have pursued inside Somaliland, and so that they claim a legitimacy from this shared history of persecution and development since 1991. And so the picture you see here, there's a lot going on in this picture. When I took this picture, this was a few years ago in 2011, a Somaliland presidential election in Hargeisa, the capital city of Somaliland. These people are queuing to vote. Behind them, this is a monument in the centre of Hargeisa. I don't know if anyone's been to Hargeisa and has seen this, but this is an old Somali Air Force MiG that was alleged, well, it's not alleged, it did happen. These fighter jets were taking off from Hargeisa airport to bomb the city in the late 80s. Okay, and this is part of the narrative of the civil war in Somalia and the way this is presented by Somalis. And you see here the Somali flag. Now this is the only place in Hargeisa where you would see a Somali flag, and that's on the tail of this fighter jet, which makes up such an important part of this narrative that the Somalilanders portray about their nationalism. And then you can see the iconography of the Somali nation embodied in this picture. That's the Somali president, and this performance that's going on. And so the point that I make here is that this conception of state building, which is ongoing and is a reality, takes very different cues and doesn't play on the ethno-nationalist card of Somali identity. Although there's an interesting tension here, because Somalilanders consider themselves no less Somali than southern Somaliland, than southern Somalia. But the political project is one that takes a very different shape. And also in Hargeisa you have higher levels of media control, because the state is more developed and it has a greater capacity to control the space of the public sphere. So that's why I include Somaliland more for a comparison of how these nationalistic discourses are being used across Somalia. So methodology and next steps. My critical discourse analysis of Somali language text is something that I'm engaged in at the moment. As I said before, I've managed to build up a fairly substantial archive of texts that I'm going through and translating and analysing. I'm about to start the stage where I go back to Somalia and talk to people, interviews, focus groups with consumers and producers of news media across Somalia. And my research sites are going to be Mogadishu, Garowe, Hargeisa and Borao. Mogadishu, South Central, Garowe, the capital of Puntland, and Hargeisa and Borao in the self-declared state of Somaliland. The questions I'm asking people, I'm not interested in asking people about their perceptions of nationalism and Somali identity and the politics of Somalia. The reason that I'm not interested in asking them that is that I know from experience working in Somalia that the answers that I get will be very much coloured by my identity as a researcher, as a foreigner, as a non-Muslim. What I'm interested in asking people has much more to do with the technical aspect of media. How they engage with these media markets, which are so diverse and privatised and fragmented. What do they read? What news media do they consume? Why do they use this website and not that website? Is it to do with a regional focus? Is it to do with a perceived lack of bias in that source? Is it to do with a political affiliation, a religious affiliation, a clanic affiliation? What do they use? What type of technology? Do they still use print media, print journalism? How do they see that? How do they see the environment of media control, for example, in Somalia? So in terms of these focus groups, I'm much more interested in the technical side of the media environment. The discourse I'm interested in getting from the debates that are happening between Somalis, and these debates are found within the public sphere of news media, of media which is designed for a Somali-speaking audience. And also observation where possible, and this is not necessarily easy in Somalia, of sites of what I would call nationalist performance. And the picture I include down here is a picture of an airport. This is Beledweyne airport in central Somalia, very near the border with Ethiopia. It's an airport that I pass through quite a lot through my work with the Red Cross. And I apologise for the poor quality of the picture. I was trying to take this without getting arrested. But you can see here 4 flags flying at the airport. Got the Ethiopian flag, got the Djiboutian flag, the African Union flag, and the little small one at the end is the Somali flag. And this just sort of struck me. And these nations, the Ethiopians and the Djiboutians, are the troop contributing countries who are in Hiran region, in Beledweyne, who maintain the security and conduct military operations inside Hiran against Al-Shabaab. They control this airport, so that's why their flags are there. And you have this little Somali flag at the end. And airports, just because I've spent a lot of time passing through airports in Somalia all over the country, are one of these sort of places of nationalist performance, because you really have this interface between these sort of islands of security, in a way, these airports, and the hinterland. I mean, Al-Shabaab are in the hinterland behind this hill. But this airport is a zone of security. It's secured, and these are also places of quite intense political significance sometimes, in that you have travelling politicians, delegations that move around the country. They arrive at airports. They are greeted with ceremonies and nationalist performances of political identity. And this interface between foreign troops and the local population and local political actors is very important. And this is just one example of a possible site where the nation really is performed for an audience. As I said, I'm about to be going back to Somalia, to my different research sites, to meet people, talk to people more, continue my analysis of the discourses and the Somali language texts. I hope this has been interesting, and I welcome any questions, comments, critiques, please.
Oh, thanks very much, Peter, for a comprehensive and nuanced talk. It was really good. Maybe as a first question, you can go back to the gentleman at the back.
Did I sort of answer what you were?
Yes and no. I'm still digesting, so let me hold off. But just 3 quick little questions, and then I'll keep thinking. First one is, in the cartoon you showed us by the Toronto.
Yeah.
I noticed the 2 gentlemen who I guess were critiquing the boot.
Yes.
Were wearing secular clothes.
Yes.
So this would not be a cartoon that Al-Shabaab would be happy about. That's the first question. The second one is, in terms of your onward fieldwork, talking to people about what media they access and so on and so forth, and the technical aspects of it. To what extent, you just mentioned very honestly, your identity is a barrier to certain entrances. Is there any way of getting access to Al-Shabaab people without putting your life in danger? To talk to them, whether in Somalia or in Toronto or Nairobi or anywhere else. And then the last question is, when you made the sort of, not confession, but the realistic statement about access problems and certain concocted sort of replies, would it assist you, or is it feasible for you to get some of the data you need by doing a mass, say, random survey? I know surveys are done in Hargeisa and places like that, even in Mogadishu, where you would have Somali interviewers, and maybe not so much asking the sort of value-related questions, but just the objective ones about what media people have access to and maybe how they view it. So you get much bigger, more robust samples, and then you use your own activity for more targeted interviews based on that material. Anyway, those are just...
Yeah, okay. So for the first question about the cartoon, yes, the two guys in the cartoon are in secular dress. These two figures pop up in many of his cartoons as the sort of two old wise men who, talk about Somali politics. What's so interesting about Amin Amir is the fact that he critiques everyone, like across the spectrum, which is why he's so popular. And there's not that many cartoonists who work in the Somali context, and he is undoubtedly the most famous. And it's amazing the extent to which he is referenced all across Somalia by different groups. And but in terms of the Shabab, they wouldn't reproduce his cartoons in their media. But I have seen in certain forums places where people who may be more inclined to those sort of interpretations of the conflict would at certain points reference his work. But officially, no, the Shabab wouldn't engage with that.
Because one thing you didn't mention is there are a number of Somali journalists who have been assassinated by Shabab.
Oh, indeed, yeah. Well, assassinated by Shabab and also other actors as well. It's not just Shabab assassinating journalists. And this goes to the heart of journalism in Somalia. And journalism in Somalia is a very dangerous business, as you note. In terms of Al-Shabaab access, I've had the privilege, I suppose, yes, over the last couple of years to meet a lot of members of Al-Shabaab in my work with the ICRC. I would love to write a PhD about Somali prisons and Al-Shabaab in Somali prisons, but I can't do that because I'm bound by the confidentiality of the dialogue that the Red Cross has with prisoners of war and in these places, and that's something I take very seriously, because without that confidentiality the ICRC would not have the access that it does to sensitive places of detention in Somalia. In terms of access now, I would love to. I would love to engage. I don't see the possibility to be able to do that without getting myself kidnapped. That's the reality, really. In most places where dialogue with Al-Shabaab is very difficult for big organisations who are trying to work in these places, but for individual researchers without the resources for security, etc., or the security that would be necessary for that, no. So I have to engage with these discourses and these dialogues in the spheres that I can access, which is through communications and media. In terms of access surveys, I'm limited to one of the problems that I have is that many of the networks of contacts that I've built up in Somalia are related to my work with the Red Cross. So I have very good contacts in places all over, and people who are very willing to help me and talk to me and facilitate my research. The problem is that to facilitate the kind of large-scale surveys that you talk about, to do that I would need to use those networks in a way that maybe would sort of compromise again the confidentiality and the perception of neutrality of the ICRC in Somalia. In that, if people are going out and polling, on behalf of me, as a researcher doing something that's very different from ICRC work, I think that might cause issues. And I've got a fair number of contacts in universities, in terms of research assistants, possibly. I'm going to try and pursue that when I'm in Somalia. So maybe that would be a possibility. There's also stuff like online polling, which I've sort of flirted with that idea, these kind of things, because the people that I'm interested in, these are people who are very much active online. And if you can find ways for them just to do a simple, straw poll, you can that would produce a better data sample than the much more anecdotal stuff that I'm going to get from the focus groups and interviews. But that's definitely something I'm considering.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Hannah.
Well, thank you very much. What kind of struck me a bit was that you talked about the narratives, different narratives that exist from either the federal government or Al-Shabaab or other actors. But also, if you look at Al-Shabaab, there are nuances, and there are also infighting in Al-Shabaab. So the the way that Al-Shabaab has developed over the last, especially the last couple of years, so the last maybe 4 years, the kind of, when you have like the local and the international wing, and the international wing becoming stronger and kind of getting rid of all the people that are more interested in Somali issues and people that are more interested in global jihad that are taking over. And surely there's also like this discourse, and that's probably, I mean, that's obviously not portrayed in the media or in these propaganda videos, because that is supposed to kind of represent the unity of Al-Shabaab, which is just basically the face of Al-Shabaab, and beneath that you have all these kind of structures. And part of that is also, and I suppose, I mean, part of that is also this, you mentioned the narrative, the meta-narrative of Islamic identity and of a Muslim identity in Somalia, and that being kind of by these internationals, especially in Al-Shabaab, being used as kind of counter the clan narratives. But underneath that, you have, like, since 2006, since the Union of Islamic Courts, you have this strong kind of Hawiyya dominance that might be getting less and less, or might still be there. But you still have like some clans that dominate even Al-Shabaab, although there are these kind of pan-Islamic narratives. And that would be interesting. It's really hard to get into that. I mean, for the very reason of the question that you asked, because it's very hard to get access to Al-Shabaab. So all these questions are kind of like trying to figure out what comes out, what the public face of Al-Shabaab, but that is what it is, the public face, but not what's beneath.
Yeah. To respond to those sort of 2 points, I guess, the local internationalist sort of tension within Al-Shabaab is actually the reason why I got so interested in these discourses, because I felt that the internationalist narrative of Islamic militancy or Islamist militancy in Somalia was getting a lot of attention, and people were analysing that and looking at it in that context. But the nationalist side of that coin wasn't. It was just sort of taken for granted. I mean, in 2006, when the Ethiopians invaded, people made the point that this is the time when Al-Shabaab emerged from the Union of Islamic Courts as an independent military actor. It gained its legitimacy at that period from a nationalistic defence, nationalistic narrative against the Ethiopians. But what that nationalism actually was, or what Somali nationalism in the 21st century, after 20 years of state collapse, what that actually is, was never interrogated by people. And so when I started to look at the media, which definitely reflects the one side of that coin, I started to see these discourses and see this iconography of Somali nationalism. And the other point to that is I think that the fortunes of Al-Shabaab will wax and wane. I think they will remain a force, or elements of them will remain a force in Somali politics for the coming time. But as a military organisation, who knows? But Islamism in Somalia as a force is there to stay. The political future of Somalia, whether it's the SFG or whether it's other factions, is very much orientated towards Islamist modes of governance of different brands. So those discourses of Islamic ethno-nationalism will remain important beyond Al-Shabaab. And so that's why I'm really trying to focus on this nationalistic side of that coin. But that tension, and I mean that tension of Al-Shabaab between the local and the internationalist, they play on that quite cleverly. The ambiguity of their discourse is quite remarkable. And they can use that, for example, in trying to expand the war into Kenya. They can play on a Somali an ethnic Somali identity in Somalia, but then they can also play on the Islamic identity or identities of coastal populations and ethnic groups who are not Somali. So that tension creates ambiguity, and that actually produces options and opportunities for them to reach out to different people. And then in terms of the clan realpolitik, I mean, and the fact of the domination of certain clans, I mean, that's definitely true. It's very difficult because Al-Shabaab is such a secretive organisation to really engage with that. I think what's so interesting about Al-Shabaab for me is that in the early stage, and if you looked at the composition of the Shura Council, the level of clan diversity at that stage of Al-Shabaab was greater than pretty much any other political organisation that had existed in Somalia for a very long time. There was no other coherent administration or apparatus, because that's what Al-Shabaab as governors at that time was, than what Al-Shabaab was. And that hasn't been surpassed necessarily. And so again, that makes that discourse of ethno-nationalism very interesting. But yeah, the realpolitik of clans is definitely important.
Just a very, very quick question, sorry, but another aspect is quite, because you mentioned it's quite difficult for you to ask questions about nationalism and clan forever. But I would also imagine that it's difficult for everybody, I think, but I think if anybody could ask these questions, it might, to some extent, intuitively I think it might be easier for somebody like you than if a Somali goes and asks you, and obviously not as simply as what do you think about this and that, but you'd probably be more suspicious of what clan are you, what agenda do you have, and why do you ask me about this? And it's quite... Yeah.
The other thing is that people will think I'm a spy. Because that's fairly common in Somalia, I approach that territory with great caution because I know of the reputation that certain researchers have got in doing this kind of fieldwork in Somalia, and people do become associated with certain groups and certain clans, and because the networks that people use to get the informants are often along these clan lines, if you use those to get the interviews, then you start going this way of becoming associated with certain groups, and it's very difficult to remain neutral. And just my experience of discussing these topics informally with colleagues of mine, Somali colleagues of mine, people that I meet, have just shown me that it can get quite tense quite quickly. But if opportunities do come up to engage people on those specific issues or specific questions, people who I think will give me an answer that's not necessarily based on my own identity or what the identity they perceive of me, then maybe there'll be room for that. But inshallah.
Yeah, gentlemen.
The collapse of the Somali states also led to the collapse of institutions which uphold the rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's a lot of interclan fighting in Somalia. So, how do they arbitrate these interclan disputes?
The judicial context of Somalia post-state collapse is really quite fascinating. The way you see what you might call sort of traditional justice mechanisms of the clan and how clans interact in terms of blood money payment and the settling of disputes have very much, in many places where there are non-functioning institutions, have very much come into the fore. And often there's a hybridity between semi-functioning institutions like courts and prisons and police forces, and then these traditional quote-unquote justice mechanisms, and it makes it very, very complicated, and in many ways it sort of changes people's perception of how justice systems should work. And this is something that actually links quite nicely with my research on ethno-nationalism, because these ways of conflict mediation or dispute or reconciliation between clans are often presented as being quintessentially Somali, right? And for example, in Al-Shabaab propaganda, they talk about how Al-Shabaab have facilitated these conferences between clans which take on this sort of traditional Somali, vibe, where they have the clan elders sitting together under the tree to discuss blood money payments in order to create peace in that particular region. So the way in which these justice mechanisms operate and the way they are discussed is very interesting, and it's also very relevant to my research. But it's a fascinating judicial context in Somalia.
Neil?
Thanks, Pete. The first simple question. Has Turkey come up in any of your research?
As who, sorry?
Turkey. the Turkish government
Oh,
and
okay.
the involvement in Somalia, and the ideas around the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, interesting question. Turkey as seen as because the discourse is so much focused on external actors. Turkey are a hugely important external actor, and therefore they come up in the public sphere quite a lot. The Turkish President Erdogan was in Mogadishu a couple of days ago. Amin Arts had a cartoon on about the Turkish, and celebrating the difference between when Erdogan came the first time a couple of years ago and the situation now. Where Somalia is presented as being more peaceful and development has happened because of Turkish assistance and stuff like that. So at the moment, Turkey are riding quite a high wave of popularity in the public sphere, not amongst Al-Shabaab, of course, who explicitly target the Turkish because they're the primary backer, or seen as being the primary backer of the Somali Federal Government. This whole neo-Ottoman thing is very interesting, and the way in which it's fascinating the way in which the Turkish are trying to play on this Ottoman legacy, which was a colonial legacy. It was a colonial relationship, but now it's being couched in terms of religious solidarity, in that we are Muslims, and there's an identification here. So, as I said, I think the way in which the Turkish government has played a very clever PR game. And given very concrete and visible support in terms of infrastructure projects, and the Turkish is so visible in Mogadishu, has meant that people haven't sort of questioned or challenged this external actor yet. And at the moment, they retain quite a high degree of popularity. But we'll see. That might change. It depends how they play the game.
Next question. So then, at the risk of being a terrorist sympathizer, so why would it, in what ways does your research deviate from the kind of UN propaganda about the failed state, about how Al-Shabaab is kind of the enemy? Why can't we see Al-Shabaab in this context as a kind of post-colonial moment of consciousness and resistance?
Yeah, I'm not an apologist for Al-Shabaab, but I am interested in their discourse and the way they frame the conflict. And the point that I made earlier is that the Islamism and the history of political Islam and changing forms of Islamic identification in Somalia are a reality, and they have a history that goes back 30 odd years. The political Islam and Salafism and Wahhabism and extremism, Takfiri ideology, didn't start with Al-Shabaab. They grew out of a much wider trend in society which allowed space for those type of discourses. And so if Shabaab are defeated and degraded militarily, which they probably will be over the coming years, certain discourses which they have of Islamism and Islamo ethno-nationalism will still remain. And so, because I think what I'm trying to get to with the research, and to make it a counterpoint to some of the other interpretations of the Somali reality, is to escape these dichotomies of extremist Al-Shabaab, with their Takfiri ideology, and then the rest of the Somali population who are liberal, secular, orientated Sufis, And it's nonsense. It's nonsense. You look at changing practices of public piety, the use of the veil, the sermons that you hear in mosques all over Somalia. These are discourses which illustrate the I don't want to say the Islamization, but the increasing relevance of Salafi Wahhabi discourses. So that will last longer than Al-Shabaab.
Okay, going to use for one final question.
We talked a lot about the narratives, and that implies kind of consciousness, and that's important. But I'm curious about how narratives relate to other ways in which these kinds of things take place. I mean, you mentioned performance, but actually you're a bit elusive about what performance actually means. And I think, you said performance is kind of difficult to find, but yet, in my mind, performance is everywhere all the time. So it just requires doing some field work to advance this situation. So performance might be one angle, but there's also another, if South Africans, who I know, would say, what about political economy, for example? You haven't mentioned that at all. I think it's probably significant somehow. Could you say more about that and how it relates to this question of narratives?
Okay, so in terms of the political economy angle, I mean, people do a lot of good work on Somalia looking at the economic networks which underpin business in Somalia, and there's some sort of interesting sort of speculative research about the relationship between some of these discourses, Islamism, for example, and certain business networks which operate in Somalia, and you could speculate that that networks of political economic networks that exist in Somalia have been not necessarily facilitated, but there's an overlap with some of these discourses, and for example, the Salafi business community that goes beyond Somalia and into Kenya. And yeah, when you look at the realpolitik of Somalia, money talks, and the material resources which these groups or constructed groups are fighting over they are material, and I think in the paper I quote at length someone who's talking about the resource conflicts in the central Somali region. And he makes very good points about the material roots of these conflicts which have gone on, and it's not about Salafis versus Sufis, it's not about ideology and discourse, it's about cold, hard, resources and material. And the critique, the point that I make about that narrative is that it just sort of throws out the ideological. It goes too far to the other side, and so from my sort of more constructivist, perspective, looking at the relationship between these material interests and the ideology or the narratives, that's where I want to try and get a bit more and to go into these political economy points. And then in terms of the narratives and the performance, you're right. The performance of nationalism is everywhere. I think the point that I was making is that in certain places, as a researcher, it's very difficult for me to do the kind of ethnographic observation that I would like to do. I would love to do that in Mogadishu. I can't because I don't have the freedom of movement around the city. In other places like Somaliland, for example, it is much more possible. And some of the stuff that I was doing before, I sort of broadened my geographical focus, was very explicitly on the performance of nationalism in the ceremonies and events, choreographed by the Somaliland state. And some of the pictures that I put up there show that, and that's definitely something I want to engage with again in Hargeisa and also in Puntland, because I think in Garowe I have a bit more freedom to move around.
Just to follow up, picture you in Mogadishu, stuck in a hotel, and winter movement. In a sense, it's not itself part of the performance. In the sense that not a performance that's directed by someone, as in a theatre show, but in the sense that everyone is complicit and involved in a performance of something. So the very fact that you, because of your position, your background, your race, etc., cannot move around in certain ways. Is that not itself part of the performance?
Absolutely. And hotels are actually quite interesting, very interesting places in Somalia, and that's why I'm happy to, that's why I don't think it's a waste of my time to spend a few weeks, in Mogadishu just in a hotel, because these are the places where the great and the good, the Somali bourgeoisie, come to drink tea and to listen to the radio and read newspapers and talk about politics. And there are also places where the state or actors put on performances, very explicit ceremonies and things. Actually, the hotel that I'm staying in, Shamu Hotel in Mogadishu, was the site of one of the worst suicide bombings in Mogadishu, which happened in 2009. The bombing allegedly by Al-Shabaab of a ceremony for medical students. This cost Al-Shabaab very dearly in terms of the propaganda battle. But that's the place that I'm staying, and so there's definitely sort of performances around that, and these places, and the role that these places serve in society for the very sort of technologies of media and the discussions around media that I'm trying to get into.
Thanks. Do people want to continue this, or do people want to go for lunch? If people are happy to continue, I think we can. Yeah.
I have a question. I see on the data collection phase of the research, I don't know whether you consider looking for crimes, because that is where you need a lot of jobs and thousands of knowledge.
Yeah.
A lot of Somalis do a lot of crimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been looking at poetry and songs as well, because as I said, so much of this stuff, even though it exists in the oral culture, whether it's radio or whether it's poetry, it finds its way into cyberspace. And people write down these poems, and they end up on the website. And there's a whole strain of Al-Shabaab jihadist poetry, but in the Gabbay style, right? And so the changing technologies of how material like poetry gets reproduced and then disseminated, I think is very interesting. But poetry, definitely, yeah. It's just poetry's really difficult to translate. It's something that I honestly struggle with. If it's newspaper articles and reports, or the Constitution, or everyday dialogue, but the poetic language of Somali is so rich that my language skills, I can get there, but it's not easy. It's not easy.
Hannah.
So it's quite interesting when you mentioned the hotels, and kind of like it seems to be like a bit like the Parisian kind of scene where people meet. But how easy is it to get to international actors, to talk to Amazon people, to talk to people from the Turkish mission, from the British mission, from people who kind of who participate like from an external perspective? How easy is that to get to talk about what they see is happening, so in relation to these narratives and constructs?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the sort of the perceptions of the external actors themselves, I kind of see as like an afterthought to the first part of the research which I'm doing, which is much more on the discourses of the Somalis themselves. I think in terms of access, I'm quite lucky in that these are a lot of people who Amazon, UN figures, embassies are people I have been engaging with from my previous work. So I think I can engage them at some point, but I might try and do that later on down the line to say, look, you're portrayed in this way. This is how you are perceived, or this, what do you think about that? Is that part of your consciousness? Do you adjust your modes of action according to these things? So hopefully at some point down the line I will get there. Yeah.
Gentlemen.
If I were your supervisor, the only thing I would be worried about is that even before you go back to this next phase of your fieldwork, you know too much. Because supervisors are supposed to be like midwives. They want to see the degree product produced. And I would be a little bit concerned that you might drown under not just the weight of the material you already have and that you're going to have, but you also have too many interesting ideas. Now, you seem to be a fairly well-organized person, so I'm sort of joking about that. But the one thing that strikes me, and going back to my first question, is, and this is just my interest, it may not be yours, it may be far too narrow, but what I would do if I could inherit all of your material and understanding is to look at the effort of reconstructing Somalia that's going on, And to maybe put the question the other way around is, given all of the forces of fragmentation that you pointed out using the map and so on, and it would have been interesting on the map like that to show not just the concentrations of population, but also the concentration of different types of resources. I mean, most of the food in Somalia that people eat, where does it come from? You know about the rivers in the south and so on. And there are various other kinds of resources, organized militias, people with firepower and so on, and also media. I mean, you can do lots of things with maps. But to ask the question, who, under what circumstances, actually put forward a pan or a nationalist, all-encompassing Somali ideology at all? I mean, is it just people in Mogadishu who want to get international resources? Is it people who, in the struggle for the control of local resources, have lost out? So the only way that they can have careers, whether economic, political, religious, whatever, is to fall back on or to try to exploit the all-encompassing ideology. So it would really be to, if I can use the word map again, to identify the context in which at least actors think it's in their interest to try and blow that horn. Which is aside from, and I guess that would also tie into the questions of how realistic is it? I mean, when you talk about Frontland, when you talk about, Somaliland having broken off, the Jubaland initiative and so on and so forth, it seems like everything that's moving is moving in the opposite direction. It's just this sort of inherited anti-colonial nation of a five-pointed, Somalia, then it was the republic at some point, and the international community has been doing everything they could do, or maybe half of it, realistically, for the last couple of decades to try to get a coherent state, because that's how the world is supposed to be organized, into coherent states with boundaries and so on. But as I said, there is so much that you've given to support all of the motivations and energies in the other extremes, except maybe for the partial exception of Al-Shabaab, that say we can have a coherent state, notwithstanding our international jihadist ties, and I think the point is a valid one, that there's been this split with it. Say, we're the only people who can organize any type of coherence within whatever boundaries we can come up with. But aside from that, from the secular side, everything which is fascinating, especially for me, is under what context do people come out with a pan-inclusive ideology, and with whom does that resonate, and for what purposes, for motivation?
Well, I think, to respond to that, I think the last couple of years has seen a marked and clear change in Somali politics. It is different to what it was before. The 14, 15, whatever it was, peace conferences from 1991 onwards, and the transitional federal government and all this kind of stuff. Things are different now, and this federalisation process is happening, and there have to be results. Whether elections are going to happen in 2016, which is the plan, that's unrealistic, but this is going to coalesce into some kind of new political reality for Somalia. That doesn't mean that it will be stable, that doesn't mean it will hold together, but it's got a better chance of holding together now than it has done in over the last 2 decades. So these discourses within that reality of the game has changed now, there's a recognised government, that's what I'm trying to get into. I like the idea of putting the question the way you did it, in terms of who puts forth these pan-Somali discourses when. I think what I would say to that is that what struck me most about these discourses is the variety of actors who do that. It's not just Mogadishu, it's not just it's not just the Shabab, whatever. It's different people at different times, and they're full of contradictions and ambiguities, and people use the language of nation often to pursue very, very small agendas. But because this language of the nation and of division, like Kalakabio, and clan resonates with people, they can use that language to, pursue some very exclusionary goals.
Have you read James Madison and I guess Hamilton's book, The Federalist?
Yeah.
Because I would think that is very, very relevant in terms of what you just identified
Yeah.
is the tension, but in some ways contributing power of having strong arguments for federalist units which don't necessarily destroy the possibility of a state. And I'm glad that you've looked at that, as I kept thinking about when you were talking about the federalization issue. Building up and having investments and narratives and so on at the federal level, as you suggest, don't necessarily negate the idea. It depends what's going to be the relationship. Just like now, what's going to be the relationship between Greece and the rest of Europe? They're not fighting, but I mean physically, but let's see what happens in the next couple of weeks. I think that's also a kind of a maybe bizarre or sort of more far out parallel, but nevertheless, what's the relationship between internal coherence at these local levels, or regional levels, and anyway.
Yeah, thanks.
On that note, that might be a good note to end on. Thanks so much, Peter, for your talk, and
thanks for your questions.
We all sure you are a spy, of course.
Everyone does.
I think there's tea outside. If you want to help themselves, and continue going forward.